All right, so today we're going to continue on with parallelograms. So if you've been keeping up, you just learned about the 5 properties of a parallelogram. So we know that if it's a parallelogram, then both sets of opposite sides are parallel, both sets of opposite sides are congruent, both sets of opposite angles are congruent, consecutive angles are supplementary, and diagonals bisect each other. So today we're going to kind of turn that around. So we're going to talk about the converse of those statements. And basically converse just means you're going to flip it over. So today it's going to be about if you see one of those properties, then you know you have a parallelogram. Whereas the previous lesson was if you know it's a parallelogram, then you have these properties. So if we take a look at it, the first one is the definition, so it stays the same. A parallelogram is a quadrilateral with both pairs of opposite sides parallel. So if we see a shape, a quadrilateral, where both sets of opposite sides are parallel, and we know that with the little arrows, then we know that that's a parallelogram. Okay, the next property talks about opposite sides are congruent. So if both sets of opposite sides of a quadrilateral are congruent, then the quadrilateral is a parallelogram. So again, we're looking at the picture and we are looking to see if both sets of opposite sides are congruent. If we see that, then we know it's a parallelogram. Now they can use the marks or they can put numbers there, but as long as the opposite sides match, then it works. Okay, the next one, we're going to flip around this statement. If it's a parallelogram, then opposite angles are congruent. So if we flip that over, we're going to say if opposite angles are congruent, then it is a parallelogram. All right, so again, we're looking at the picture and we're looking to see if the angles that are across from each other are the same. So they can use the little arc marks, whereas like on this angle and this angle, I have 1 mark. On the other set of angles, I have 2 marks. Or I can give you numbers. As long as the ones that are across from each other match, then we know it's a parallelogram. Okay, the next one deals with consecutive angles or supplementary. Now, when I flip this one over, it's a little weird. So basically, we're going to say that if one angle is supplementary to both consecutive angles, then the quadrilateral is a parallelogram. So we know supplementary means that it adds to 180. And we know consecutive means next to each other. So in other words, if I knew that these angles were marked like this, so we have x, y, x, then these 2 angles add up to 180, and these 2 angles add up to 180. So x plus y equals 180. So they both have to work for it to be a parallelogram. Okay, the next one deals with the diagonals. So we learned on the previous lesson that if it's a parallelogram, then diagonals bisect each other. So today we're going to talk about if the diagonals bisect each other, then we know it's a parallelogram. So in other words, if I look at the picture and I see that this diagonal is marked the same and I see that this diagonal is marked the same, then that has to be a parallelogram. Now the last one is a little weird. So this one is not one of our 5 properties, but it says that if we can show that one set of opposite sides are both congruent and parallel, then it has to be a parallelogram. All right, so as we continue on, I kind of did shortcut versions of these. Basically, as we look at these next few problems, we're going to be looking for one of these pictures or one of these properties. And you can write the condensed version that I have here, but basically you're looking for one of these pictures. All right, so if I look at example 1, it says decide if this is a parallelogram and explain. So on part A, I noticed that these sides are marked the same and the other sides are marked the same. So this is a parallelogram because both sets of opposite sides are congruent. All right, so I put the yes and then I explained using one of those properties. Now when I look at B, now this one shows that you have this set of opposite sides congruent, but that's all it tells you. Now our property says both sets have to be congruent, so we cannot say that this is a parallelogram. And the biggest reason is you just don't have enough information. So no, not enough info. If you also put both sets of opposite sides are not congruent, I would accept that as well. Okay, looking at example 2. When I look at this one, now this is dealing with angles instead of sides. So I look at the opposite angles and I can tell that those do not match. So we're going to say, no, this is not a parallelogram because both sets of opposite sides, angles, are not congruent. All right, so both sets of opposite angles are not congruent. Now, when you look at part B, though, and I look at the opposite angles, well, those match, and I look at these angles and those match, so this one is a yes because both sets of opposite angles are congruent. All right, so you just put your yes or no and then what property you used. Okay, looking at example 3. Now, if I think about the properties in that last page here, so I'm going to scroll this back, and I see that there's only one that deals with the things that are going in the center, the diagonals, and it says if those are bisected, then this has to be a parallelogram. So looking at this picture, I see that this diagonal is marked the same, and I see that this diagonal is marked the same. So this one is yes because the diagonals bisect each other. Okay, looking at the next one. Now this one we only have 3 angles, and there's only one property that does the 3 angles, and that's the consecutive one. So what we're going to do is we're going to decide, do those add up to 180? And when I add those up, we do get 180. And then I check it on this side, and when I add those up again, I get 180. So this does work because consecutive angles are supplementary. All right, that leaves us with one example left. Now this one's a little different. It says, what values of x and y make this a parallelogram? So when I look at the picture, the numbers it gives us, you need to ask yourself, is that dealing with sides or angles? And in this case, it's sides. So what property deals with sides that's going to help us? And hopefully you can think about the fact that we know that these opposite sides have to match. So we know that y has to equal 8. And then these sides will have to match. So 3x minus 5 has to equal 2x plus 1. All right, so we're going to subtract 2x from both sides. So we just get x minus 5 equals 1. And then we're going to add 5. So we get x equals 6. So for this to be a parallelogram, y would have to be 8 and x would have to be 6 because opposite sides have to be congruent. So the first part of the homework is going to be a bunch of pictures. It's just going to say, are these a parallelogram and why? So it's like examples 1, 2, and 3. And then the back side is more like example 4, where you have to figure out what property you're going to use. And does that mean they need to add up to 180, or does that mean they have to be equal? So that's kind of what you're doing today. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out by email or send me a question on Google Classroom, and I will get back with you. Thanks.